Officers Ryan Mercer and Luke Grant were driving down the bustling streets of Brookhaven on a humid Wednesday afternoon. The city, infamous for its zero-tolerance policies and aggressive profiling, hummed with activity. Street vendors peddled their wares, children raced down sidewalks, and the sharp wail of a distant siren added to the cacophony. It was amid this chaos that the officers noticed Elijah Coleman. He emerged from a sleek black sedan parked just outside City Hall, dressed impeccably in a tailored navy suit. Carrying a polished leather briefcase, Elijah looked like a man on a mission. His poised demeanor and confident stride seemed to scream success. Yet, for Officers Mercer and Grant, his image was more than just businesslike. It was suspicious. Mercer tapped Grant on the arm. "What do you think? Up to no good?" Grant smirked. "Could be. Worth checking out." Without hesitation, they flipped on their patrol car's lights and pulled up alongside Elijah. The man had barely taken 3 steps when Mercer stepped out, his hand resting on the holster of his firearm. "Excuse me, sir," Mercer said, his tone authoritative. "We need you to stop for a moment." Elijah paused, confusion flickering across his face. "Is there an issue, officer? Mind telling us what you're doing around here?" Mercer's question was more accusation than inquiry. "I have a meeting," Elijah replied calmly, "at City Hall. I'm an attorney." He held up his briefcase as if to emphasize his point. Grant, now out of the car, joined Mercer. "An attorney, huh? Let me see some ID." Elijah's brows furrowed. "I'm sorry, but may I ask why I'm being stopped? Did I do something wrong?" Mercer's eyes narrowed. "We ask the questions here. Show us your ID, or we'll have to take this further." The street around them grew quieter. Passers-by slowed their pace, their gazes darting between Elijah and the officers. Elijah took a steadying breath, reaching for his wallet. He handed over his driver's license, keeping his expression neutral. Grant examined the ID with exaggerated scrutiny. "Elijah Coleman," he read aloud, a sarcastic lilt to his voice. "What kind of lawyer are you?" "A civil rights attorney," Elijah said, his tone even. Grant's expression soured. "Civil rights? That's rich. Is there something illegal about being a civil rights attorney?" Elijah asked. His polite demeanor barely concealed his growing frustration. Mercer crossed his arms. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in the area. You fit the description." Elijah tilted his head. "And what, exactly, is the description?" Mercer didn't answer. Instead, he gestured toward Elijah's briefcase. "What's in there?" "Documents for my meeting. We'll need to check that," Grant said, stepping forward. "No, you won't." Elijah's voice was firm now. "Unless you have probable cause, you cannot search my belongings." The tension spiked. Mercer's jaw tightened. "Obstruction of justice, huh? That's what you're going for." Elijah's eyes widened. "Obstruction? I'm asserting my rights. Put your hands where I can see them." Mercer barked, his hand moving to his baton. The crowd grew thicker, murmurs rippling through the onlookers. "Is he resisting?" someone whispered. "That's a lawyer. They can't do that." But the officers didn't seem to care. Grant grabbed Elijah's arm, twisting it behind his back as Mercer cuffed him. "You're under arrest for obstruction of justice," Mercer announced, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "This is outrageous." Elijah protested. "I've done nothing wrong." "You can tell it to the judge," Grant sneered, shoving Elijah toward the squad car. The bystanders erupted in protest. Some pulled out their phones, recording the scene. A young woman yelled, "This is racial profiling." "He didn't do anything." "Move along," Mercer shouted at the crowd, his hand resting on his holster. "Or you'll be next." Elijah sat silently in the back of the patrol car, his mind racing. Humiliation burned in his chest, but more than that, there was fury, a cold, calculated rage. As the car sped toward the precinct, he resolved that this was far from over. By the time they reached the station, news of the arrest was already spreading. Social media lit up with videos of the encounter, hashtags like #JusticeForElijah trending within hours. Community leaders demanded answers, lawyers rallied, and protesters began to gather outside the precinct. Elijah, now in a holding cell, stared at the walls. He wasn't just a victim, he was a fighter. And this wasn't the end of his story. It was only the beginning. Elijah kept his composure as the cold metal of the handcuffs clicked into place around his wrists. The weight of humiliation bore down on him, but his eyes remained steady, locked on the two officers. "You're making a mistake," he said firmly, his voice unwavering despite the tension in the air. Mercer smirked, leaning in close. "The only mistake here, buddy, is you thinking you're untouchable." The scene on the busy Brookhaven street had drawn a crowd. Smartphones were raised, their cameras capturing every second. The murmurs grew louder as the video feeds began to upload to social media. Captions like "civil rights attorney detained without cause" and "racial profiling in Brookhaven" started appearing alongside hashtags like #JusticeForElijah and #EndPoliceBrutality. Elijah glanced at the crowd briefly, noticing the phones recording the ordeal. "You'll regret this," he said, his tone sharp. "You're on camera. Everyone can see what's happening." But Mercer just laughed. "On camera? Huh? You think that's going to save you?" Beside him, Grant chuckled. "They always think they're smarter than us," he sneered. "But guess what, Mr. Big Shot Lawyer? Out here, we're the law." The officers, oblivious to the firestorm brewing online, continued to mock their detainee as they pushed him into the back of the squad car. The crowd outside the vehicle erupted in protest. "This is wrong," shouted an older woman from the sidewalk. "He didn't do anything." "You're targeting him because he's black?" added another voice, a young man holding his phone steady as he recorded the officers. Mercer turned toward the crowd, his face a mask of anger. "Back off," he barked, his hand resting on his holster. "Everyone move along unless you want to join him." The crowd shifted but didn't disperse. Some took a few steps back, but no one put their phones down. Elijah sat in the squad car, his shoulders stiff, his face calm. Internally, however, the storm was brewing. He was no stranger to profiling or injustice. He had dedicated his career to fighting it, but to be on the receiving end, shackled and humiliated for no reason, was a reminder of just how much work was left to do. "Let's see how big and bad you are when you're in lockup," Grant said, slamming the car door. As the vehicle pulled away, the officers exchanged smug grins. "Civil rights attorney, my ass," Mercer muttered. "Bet he's some kind of scammer. Probably got a record a mile long." Grant snorted. "You saw that suit? Probably laundering money for one of those big gangs around here." Always the same story. They didn't realize who Elijah was. They didn't know about his extensive record of courtroom victories or the fact that he had won several landmark cases against police departments across the state, including Brookhaven's. All they saw was a black man in an expensive suit, and that was enough for them. Back in the holding cell at the precinct, Elijah sat on the cold bench, his wrists aching from the tight cuffs. His suit jacket had been roughly pulled off during processing, and his tie was crooked. He leaned back against the wall, his mind racing but his demeanor controlled. "You're awfully quiet for someone who likes to run his mouth," Mercer taunted, standing just outside the bars. "Got nothing to say now?" Elijah met his gaze evenly. "I'll save it for court." Grant appeared, holding a manila folder he'd retrieved from his desk. "Ran his ID," he announced with mock excitement. "No priors. Just as clean as his fancy suit." Mercer's face darkened. "That just means we haven't caught him yet." They both laughed, their voices echoing in the otherwise silent holding area. Elijah closed his eyes briefly, taking a deep breath. He had endured moments like this before, staring down power, facing prejudice. But this felt different. This time, it wasn't just about him. The videos circulating online, the growing outrage, it was bigger than him now. Outside the precinct, protesters were already gathering. Signs reading, "Stop Racial Profiling," and "Justice for Elijah," waved in the air as chants filled the street. Local news crews arrived, interviewing witnesses who had seen the arrest. "It was completely unprovoked," said one woman, her voice shaking. "They stopped him for no reason. He was just walking. They didn't even tell him why." Inside, Mercer and Grant watched the commotion on a muted television screen. The news ticker at the bottom read, "Brookhaven police face backlash for alleged racial profiling." "Looks like we've got a fan club," Grant said with a grin. Mercer scoffed. "It's all noise. They'll forget about it in a week." But Elijah knew better. The videos were spreading fast, reaching national news outlets. Prominent activists and attorneys began commenting, calling for Elijah's immediate release. His colleagues, now aware of his arrest, were mobilizing, contacting the media and organizing legal action. Hours passed, and the mood inside the precinct grew more tense. Calls flooded the station, demanding an explanation for the arrest. The officers who had mocked Elijah earlier now exchanged uneasy glances as their phones rang incessantly. Grant approached Mercer. "Think we went too far?" Mercer's jaw tightened. "We didn't do anything wrong." He was resisting. Grant hesitated. Was he, though? Mercer glared at him. "Don't start." In the holding cell, Elijah finally smiled, a small, knowing smile. He wasn't powerless, and he wasn't alone. The walls that Mercer and Grant had built around their authority were cracking, and Elijah was ready to push them down. Inside the precinct, the tension in the air was palpable. Elijah Coleman was led to a dimly lit holding room, his wrists still sore from the handcuffs. He had been denied his request for a phone call, an omission glaringly illegal but all too familiar to him. Hours dragged on, punctuated only by the occasional sound of heavy boots pacing outside the door. No one had come in to question him. Instead, the officers seemed content to let him sit, simmer, and stew. "Don't worry," Mercer had sneered as he walked Elijah into the station. "We'll get to you when we feel like it." Elijah sat at the small metal table, his mind as sharp as ever. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing him rattled. The room was intentionally uncomfortable, with harsh fluorescent lights buzzing overhead and a cold draft creeping in through an unseen vent. But Elijah Coleman was a man who thrived under pressure. His calm demeanor only seemed to anger the officers. Outside the room, Mercer and Grant were standing near the desk sergeant, exchanging quiet, smug remarks. "Still no phone call?" Grant asked with a smirk, his voice low but laced with amusement. "Nope," Mercer said, leaning casually against the counter. "He can sit and wait. Let him think about what he's done." Grant chuckled. "What he's done? We didn't even tell him why he's here." Mercer shrugged. "Doesn't matter. These types think they're untouchable. He'll sweat it out eventually." But Elijah wasn't sweating. He was biding his time. Outside the station, the world was erupting. The video of his arrest, captured from multiple angles by bystanders, had gone viral. Within hours, it amassed hundreds of thousands of views across social media platforms. The hashtags #JusticeForElijah and #BrookhavenRacism trended nationally. News outlets picked up the story, and prominent civil rights activists took to Twitter, condemning the Brookhaven Police Department and demanding Elijah's immediate release. A local journalist, Sarah Mills, stood among a growing crowd of protesters outside the precinct. Microphone in hand, she reported live as activists chanted and held up signs that read, "Stop Police Brutality" and "Justice for Elijah." "Community outrage is reaching a boiling point," Sarah said into the camera. "Calls for accountability are flooding social media, with public figures and politicians now weighing in." We've also learned that the man at the center of this controversy is Elijah Coleman, a renowned civil rights attorney with a track record of holding police departments accountable. Back inside the precinct, the officers were beginning to realize the gravity of the situation. The phone at the front desk rang incessantly, with reporters, attorneys, and activists demanding answers. Mercer and Grant, however, remained defiant. "They think they can scare us into letting him go," Mercer scoffed. "Not happening." Grant hesitated. "I don't know, Mercer. This is getting out of hand. You've seen the news. They're all over this." Mercer waved him off. "They'll move on to the next scandal tomorrow. Always do." As the hours ticked by, the silence in the holding room was finally broken. The door creaked open, and the desk sergeant stepped inside. He was a stout man with graying hair, his badge slightly askew on his chest. He placed a cup of water on the table, his expression unreadable. "You comfortable?" the sergeant asked, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Elijah looked up at him, his face calm but his eyes sharp. "I've been sitting here for hours without so much as a single question. Is this how Brookhaven PD conducts its interrogations?" The sergeant crossed his arms. "You think you're special, huh?" I think I know my rights, Elijah replied evenly. And I know you're violating them. The sergeant smirked. Rights? You people always love to talk about rights. Elijah's jaw tightened, but he didn't rise to the bait. He leaned back in his chair, his voice steady. You've made your point. Now, I need my phone. I have a court case tomorrow. The sergeant blinked, his smirk faltering. Court case? Yes, Elijah said, his tone matter-of-fact. And I'm sure the judge will be very interested to hear why his lead attorney is late because he was unlawfully detained. The sergeant's face hardened. You're not going anywhere until we say so. Outside, the protests grew louder. The crowd had swelled, spilling into the streets and blocking traffic. News vans lined the sidewalks, and more journalists joined the fray. Activists with megaphones led chants that reverberated through the precinct walls. Elijah's words had an undeniable weight, and the officers knew it. As much as they wanted to assert their authority, the mounting pressure was becoming impossible to ignore. The sergeant left the room without another word, slamming the door behind him. Back at the desk, Mercer and Grant were arguing in hushed tones. We need to let him go, Grant said, glancing nervously at the growing crowd outside. No way, Mercer snapped. We release him now, and it looks like we're admitting we screwed up. Grant ran a hand through his hair. The whole country's watching, Mercer. This isn't just going to blow over. The sergeant returned, his expression grim. We've got a problem, he muttered. The mayor's office just called. They want him released immediately. Mercer's face turned red. We don't take orders from the mayor. The hell we don't, the sergeant shot back. You want to be the face of this department when it goes under? Fine. But I'm not going down with you. Elijah sat in the holding room, listening to the muffled voices outside. He knew his release was imminent. The system that had tried to break him was now buckling under the weight of its own arrogance. When the door finally opened, it was Mercer who stood there, his jaw tight with barely concealed rage. You're free to go, Mercer said through gritted teeth. Elijah stood, adjusting his tie. I'll see you in court, he said calmly, walking past Mercer without a backward glance. Outside, the cheers of the crowd erupted as Elijah stepped through the precinct doors, his head held high. The battle was far from over, but tonight, justice had taken its first step. The sergeant returned to the holding room, his expression smug as he leaned against the doorframe. He stared at Elijah, who remained seated, his posture calm but commanding. The silence between them stretched until the sergeant broke it with a mocking tone. You think the judge is going to save you, he sneered, crossing his arms. You're dreaming if you think anyone's coming to bail you out of this. Elijah raised his head, his eyes locking onto the sergeant's with a cold, steady intensity. His voice was low but powerful when he replied, I am the judge. The sergeant froze, his smirk faltering for just a second before he barked a laugh. Yeah, sure you are. And I'm the president. He leaned closer, looming over Elijah. Keep dreaming, pal. Unmoved, Elijah straightened his tie and leaned back in his chair, maintaining his composure. You might want to check your database, he said evenly. And while you're at it, start thinking about how you're going to explain this to your superiors. The sergeant's brow furrowed, his confidence wavering. What kind of game are you playing? He snapped. But something in Elijah's unwavering gaze made him hesitate. Reluctantly, the sergeant left the room and headed to the front desk, his irritation boiling over. Mercer and Grant were still there, pacing and whispering about the protests outside. The chants had grown deafening, shaking the walls of the precinct as the crowd continued to swell. What's got you all riled up? Mercer asked as the sergeant marched toward the computer terminal. That guy in there is running his mouth, claiming he's a damn judge. The sergeant growled, typing furiously into the database. Mercer laughed. A judge? Yeah, right. Did he tell you he's the mayor next? Shut up, the sergeant barked, his eyes glued to the screen. As he scrolled through the records, his expression shifted from irritation to shock. His hands froze over the keyboard as he stared at the screen. What? Grant asked, leaning in to look. What is it? The sergeant's face had gone pale, beads of sweat forming on his forehead. He swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper. Elijah Coleman. Brookhaven District Judge. Mercer's smirk vanished, and his face turned a sickly shade of gray. "You're kidding," he muttered, snatching the mouse and scrolling through the profile. There it was, Elijah Coleman's name and title, along with a photograph of the very man they had handcuffed and humiliated earlier that day. "Oh, hell," Grant whispered, his hands trembling. "This is bad. This is really bad." The sergeant stood there, stunned, the weight of the revelation sinking in. "You mean to tell me we've had the district judge sitting in a holding cell for hours, without a phone call, without charges, and with half the city outside protesting?" Mercer ran a hand through his hair, his voice rising in panic. "We didn't know. How were we supposed to know?" "Maybe," Grant muttered, his voice dripping with dread. "We could have checked his ID like we were supposed to." The sergeant slammed his fist on the desk, silencing them. "We need to fix this. Now." Inside the holding room, Elijah remained composed. He knew the moment was coming, the inevitable realization of the officer's mistake. When the door swung open, the sergeant stepped inside, his arrogance replaced by a thin veneer of forced professionalism. "Judge Coleman," he said, his voice strained, I believe there's been a misunderstanding." Elijah didn't move, his gaze piercing. "A misunderstanding?" he repeated, his tone razor-sharp. "Is that what you call hours of unlawful detention, denial of my rights, and public humiliation?" The sergeant shifted uncomfortably, unable to meet Elijah's eyes. "Look, we didn't know who you were. That's the problem," Elijah snapped, rising to his feet. "You didn't care who I was. All you saw was a black man in a suit, and that was enough for you." The sergeant's mouth opened, but no words came out. Mercer and Grant lingered in the hallway, their faces pale as they peeked inside. "You've embarrassed this department, this city, and yourselves," Elijah continued, his voice rising. "But more importantly, you've revealed exactly what's wrong with this system." The sergeant stammered, We can let you go. Right now." Elijah stepped closer, his voice calm but cutting. "You're not doing me a favor. You're covering your own backs. And believe me, this doesn't end here." The sergeant nodded quickly, retreating toward the door. Mercer and Grant scrambled to move aside as Elijah stepped into the hallway. He didn't spare them a glance, but his presence was enough to make them shrink back, their earlier bravado reduced to silent shame. Outside the precinct, the crowd erupted into cheers as Elijah emerged, his head held high. Activists and reporters surged forward, their cameras capturing the moment. Sarah Mills, the journalist who had been covering the protests, pushed through the crowd, her microphone extended. "Judge Coleman, do you have a statement?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the chants of the protesters. Elijah paused, turning to face the cameras. His voice carried over the noise, clear and commanding. "What happened today is a reminder of the systemic injustices that plague our society. But this is not just about me. This is about every person who has been profiled, humiliated, or silenced because of the color of their skin. This fight is far from over." The crowd roared in agreement, their voices uniting in a deafening cry for change. As Elijah walked away, his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was his team of attorneys, already coordinating the next steps. Behind him, the officers watched through the precinct's glass doors, their faces etched with fear and regret. For Mercer and Grant, the gravity of their actions was finally sinking in. And for Elijah Coleman, the journey to justice had only just begun. The next morning, the courtroom was an arena of tension. Every seat was occupied, the air thick with anticipation. Members of the community who had rallied behind Elijah packed the gallery, their faces resolute and defiant. Journalists jotted notes and adjusted their cameras, while activists whispered among themselves, holding signs just outside the courthouse doors. The video of Elijah's arrest had become a national story overnight. Networks dissected every frame, from Mercer's smug expression to Elijah's calm declaration of his rights. For Brookhaven, this was no ordinary day. It was a reckoning. The doors to the courtroom opened, and Elijah Coleman entered, dressed in his judge's robe. His presence was commanding, his steps deliberate. The room fell silent. Even the journalists stopped typing, their eyes glued to him. Mercer and Grant, seated at the defense table, looked like cornered animals. Gone was their bravado from the day before. Their faces were pale, their hands fidgeting nervously. Their attorney, a middle-aged man with a thinning hairline, leaned in, whispering frantically to them. Mercer kept glancing at the gallery, where familiar faces from the protest outside the precinct now stared back at him with contempt. Elijah took his seat at the bench, arranging his papers methodically before looking up. "Court is now in session," he announced, his voice steady and authoritative. It was the first time Mercer and Grant truly felt the weight of the situation. They weren't just facing the consequences of their actions. They were facing the very man they had wronged. The prosecutor rose first, presenting the charges against Mercer and Grant: illegal detention, abuse of authority, and racial profiling. With each charge read aloud, the crowd murmured in anger, and the officers seemed to shrink further in their seats. The prosecutor began, "Your Honor, this case is not just about two officers abusing their power. It's about a systemic problem that has plagued our community for too long." The actions of Officers Mercer and Grant were not isolated. They were emblematic of a culture of unchecked authority. Mercer's attorney quickly objected, his voice sharp and desperate. "Your Honor, this is highly prejudicial." Elijah raised a hand, silencing him. "Overruled. Continue, Counselor." The prosecutor presented the video evidence, displaying it on a large screen for the entire courtroom to see. The footage of Mercer and Grant's mocking remarks and unnecessary use of force played in deafening silence. Each frame felt like a hammer blow to the officer's case. When the video showed Mercer barking orders at Elijah to "shut up" and Grant sneering about "you people," the tension in the room reached a breaking point. A woman in the gallery whispered, "Disgusting," and others nodded in agreement. The prosecutor turned to the bench. "Your Honor, the defendants not only violated the rights of Judge Coleman, but demonstrated a clear bias that has no place in our justice system." Elijah's gaze shifted to Mercer and Grant. "Officers," he said, his tone icy, "do you have anything to say for yourselves?" Mercer opened his mouth, but no words came out. His attorney quickly interjected, "Your Honor, my clients regret their actions." Let them speak for themselves," Elijah interrupted. His words cut through the attorney's excuses like a knife. The courtroom held its breath. Grant finally stammered, We didn't know who you were. And if I hadn't been a judge?" Elijah asked, his voice rising slightly. "Would your actions have been any different?" Grant's face turned beet red, and he cast his eyes downward. Mercer's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Elijah leaned forward, his eyes boring into them. "You assumed my race and appearance made me a target. You ignored my rights because you believed your power was absolute. Tell me, officers, how often do you treat members of this community the same way?" Neither officer answered. The silence was damning. The defense attorney tried to regain control. "Your Honor, my clients have exemplary records." "Save it," Elijah said sharply. The gallery murmured again, this time with approval. He turned to the prosecutor. "Call your first witness." One by one, witnesses took the stand. The young woman who had recorded the arrest recounted the scene, her voice shaking with anger. "He didn't do anything," she said. "They just saw him and decided he was guilty of something." Another witness, an older man, described how he had been harassed by Mercer and Grant in the past. "They always target people like me," he said. "Like us." The prosecutor then called an expert witness, a former police captain who testified about the prevalence of racial profiling in departments like Brookhaven's. His words painted a damning picture of a culture that enabled officers like Mercer and Grant to act without accountability. By the time the prosecutor rested his case, the defense was in tatters. Mercer and Grant sat motionless, their confidence eroded completely. The gallery's glares bore into them, and even their attorney seemed resigned to defeat. Elijah addressed the courtroom. "This case is not just about what happened to me. It's about what happens to countless people who don't have the privilege of wearing a robe or sitting behind this bench. This is about justice, not just for me, but for everyone." The crowd erupted into applause despite the bailiff's calls for order. Elijah let the noise die down before delivering his closing remarks. "Accountability is not optional. It is mandatory. and this court will ensure that it is upheld. As the proceedings ended for the day, Mercer and Grant were escorted out, their heads bowed. Outside the courthouse, the crowd had swelled even further, cheering as Elijah emerged. For Brookhaven, this was the beginning of a long-overdue reckoning. For Elijah, it was another step in the fight for justice, a fight he was determined to win. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as Judge Elijah Coleman called the session to order. The gallery was packed to capacity, the audience hanging on every word. Cameras flashed as reporters scribbled notes. Activists and community leaders filled the benches, their presence a testament to the gravity of the moment. Officers Mercer and Grant, Judge Coleman began, his voice resonating with authority. You are charged with racial profiling, unlawful arrest, and abuse of power. These charges reflect not only your actions but the broader systemic issues that have plagued this community for far too long. Mercer and Grant sat at the defense table, their faces pale and their postures stiff. The confidence they had displayed on the streets of Brookhaven was gone, replaced by a tangible fear. Their attorney fidgeted nervously, knowing the evidence against his clients was overwhelming. The prosecutor stood and presented the key piece of evidence, the video of the arrest. The courtroom lights dimmed as the footage played on a large screen. Every detail was laid bare. The aggressive tone of the officers, their refusal to provide a reason for stopping Elijah, and the mocking remarks about you people. The audience watched in stunned silence, the room punctuated only by the occasional gasp or whispered exclamation. As the video ended, Judge Coleman's expression hardened. This evidence, he said, demonstrates not only a disregard for the law but a blatant abuse of power. Your actions were not just illegal, they were an affront to the principles of justice. The prosecutor called the first witnesses, civil society activists who testified about the officers' history of misconduct. One activist, a middle-aged woman named Angela Ruiz, spoke with conviction. Officers Mercer and Grant have been involved in several questionable arrests over the years, she said. Complaints have been filed, but they've always been brushed aside. This case is just the latest example of a pattern. A young man named Terrence, a local teacher, shared his experience. I was stopped by these officers last year, he said. They accused me of loitering while I was waiting for a rideshare. They didn't care when I explained. They just saw my skin color. The testimony painted a damning picture. Mercer and Grant sat rigidly, their expressions a mix of anger and shame. Their attorney tried to object, but the momentum was against them. Each story reinforced the systemic issues that Elijah had long fought to address. Then came the twist that electrified the courtroom. The prosecutor revealed that just hours before his arrest, Elijah had met with the city's mayor to discuss police reforms. The room erupted in murmurs, the irony of the situation impossible to ignore. Elijah Coleman was actively working to improve this very department, the prosecutor said, and yet, he became a victim of the very misconduct he sought to prevent. Officers Mercer and Grant are not just guilty of abusing their power. They are emblematic of the problems this community faces every day. Judge Coleman's voice cut through the noise. Order in the court. As the hearing proceeded, it became clear that the evidence against Mercer and Grant was insurmountable. The defense attorney's attempts to deflect blame were met with skepticism from the judge and outright disdain from the audience. After hours of testimony and deliberation, Judge Coleman delivered the verdict. Officers Mercer and Grant, this court finds you guilty of misconduct, abuse of power, and racial profiling. Effective immediately, you are suspended without pay. Furthermore, an independent investigation into your actions will be launched. The courtroom erupted into applause, the audience unable to contain their relief and vindication. Mercer and Grant were escorted out, their heads bowed, their careers in shambles. Later that day, the police chief held a press conference outside the precinct. Standing before a sea of protesters and reporters, he issued a public apology. On behalf of the Brookhaven Police Department, I extend my sincerest apologies to Judge Coleman and the entire community. This incident has highlighted failures within our department, and we are committed to making the necessary changes. The apology was met with cautious optimism, but the community demanded action, not just words. Under Elijah's leadership, a reform program was launched. The program included mandatory anti-bias training for all officers, the establishment of community oversight committees, and independent investigations into police misconduct. Protests and solidarity actions spread throughout Brookhaven, bringing together people from all walks of life. What began as outrage over Elijah's arrest grew into a movement for lasting change. Residents marched side by side, chanting for justice and accountability. Local businesses supported the cause, and even city officials pledged their support for the reforms. Months later, Elijah stood on the sidelines of a police training facility, watching as a new class of recruits went through their drills. These officers had been selected under stricter standards, their training focused on community engagement and de-escalation techniques. Elijah felt a glimmer of hope as he observed their progress. His ordeal had been painful and humiliating, but it had sparked a transformation. Brookhaven was changing, and he was determined to ensure that the momentum continued. As he walked away from the training grounds, Elijah reflected on the journey. The road ahead was long, but the first steps had been taken. His experience had become a powerful symbol of resilience and change, and he vowed to keep fighting for a future where justice truly meant justice for all.